be useful to have some type of organization where we can share research with each other, where we can learn from industry professionals about the issues that they are facing, especially in light of all of the technological changes that are sweeping the music industry. We can share academic research with the industry. We can find ways, perhaps, of accessing data that we wouldn't otherwise have. We can learn about trends in the industry from those who study the industry for a living. That was the idea. Been very fortunate to work with Jeannie Wilkinson as executive director of our august organization. To give you an update, we're in the process of applying for 501c3 status. We're very lucky that Terry Calvani, who is the general counsel for the American Economic Association, and more importantly, a very powerful lawyer at Fresh Fields, has volunteered to help us and lend his staff to help us apply for nonprofit status. So that's moving along. And we had the ambitious goal of holding a conference in this summer, and amazingly, Jeannie was able to pull it off. I also want to acknowledge and thank Gigi Fernandez and Bob Fink and UCLA for helping us to pull this off at this wonderful facility. So at the end of tomorrow, we've scheduled time to have an open discussion about directions that the Music Industry Research Association can go in. And we're really lucky because our entire board is here. We have sort of two boards, one board of researchers like Julie Mortimer, who I see, and Alan Sorensen, Joel Walfogel, and David Riley, Marie Connolly, and then another board with people from industry who could help give us direction. And we thought it would be useful at the end of the day tomorrow to talk about other types of activities we can do in the future, how we can kind of help the industry find a more sustainable business model, how we can support research in this area. So I'm really excited about having this start to our new organization. So the first panel, we're going to cover trends in the industry by people who study trends in the industry for a living. And really it is an outstanding group. The format is each presenter will present for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have questions from the audience, open discussion. I think if there's something which is terribly confusing, maybe you can shout out a question in the middle of the presentation. That's the economics format. But unless it is terribly confusing, why don't we wait towards the end of the... And I should also mention, we are going to be videotaping the sessions. If anyone's uncomfortable with that, let us know. We were planning on putting the videotapes up on our webpage, www.themira.org, in part because we have two sessions tomorrow that are simultaneous, so not everyone can go to all of the sessions. But if anyone's uncomfortable with having their comments or their presentations recorded, we will refrain from posting it, just so that you're aware. So I'm going to give very brief introductions for the panel because everyone's bio is in your background material, assuming that they got it into Jeannie in time. And the first speaker is Russ Crupnick, who told me to mention that he's a wonderful humanitarian.
He always wants to.
No, it's the wife. You got to get the wife. Especially if you're doing the video, you've got to get the wife thing in because
and loves his wife dearly. Is also managing partner of MusicWatch and an adjunct professor at the NYU Steinhardt Music Business Graduate Program. Russ, why don't I turn it over to you?
Thank you very much. I mentioned to Alan that my wife, if she's watching sports, she assesses the quality of the player, you know, whether it's a golfer on, whether the first thing he does is say, I want to thank my wife for helping me win the Masters. If it's the caddy or you know, somebody else kind of goes down in her esteem. What I think is really wonderful about these 2 days is I tend to deal in, we call it consumer information, what's going on with the state of the consumer. And I take a look at it from the focus of how do we understand what the consumer is doing today and use that to grow the business. And whether you call them consumers or fans or listeners or audience really doesn't matter. The whole idea for me is how do we start growing revenue and engagement in the business. So that's really what I focus on. The good news is there are an awful lot of music consumers. 98% of people do something. They buy a ticket, they buy a CD, they buy a download, they listen to AM/FM radio, they do merch. I'm convinced that the other 2% simply just don't know how to take a survey. So the size of the music audience for years has been really large. The challenge, as you know, is how do we better monetize them? How do we halt things like piracy? So enhance the good behaviors and kind of put a limit on the things that are not so good. One of the things that's really good is we're now at a point in the United States where 3 out of 4 people are now streaming. And by streaming, I'm including both kind of pure play music streaming, whether it's Spotify, Pandora, or Apple, as well as watching or listening to music videos through something like YouTube. And the whole idea, the whole conversation about monetization of those various sources is probably a conference unto itself. But I think what's really positive is there are as many people streaming right now as were buying CDs 20 years ago in what we would used to call peak CD. So the audience is there, the audience is really engaged. The question, as I said before, is how do we grow ARPU? How do we grow value of a customer? How do we monetize them? And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next few minutes. One thing to understand is we have also reached a tipping point. Some of this is we look at a lot of sales data. My colleagues Dave and Geoff will probably share that with you. We get a lot from the RIAA in terms of what's happening from a unit standpoint, a sell-through standpoint. But I think at the end of the day, there's a consumer connected to all of this who's listening. And regardless of how they're listening, the reality is that at this point, more of that timeshare is now going to streaming than to any other source. And let me just walk you through this chart very quickly. So what it says is if you take a look at an average week, and this is for the first quarter of 2017. And by the way, I see people taking pictures. I'll save you. If you'd like some of these charts, please just come up and see me or reach out to Alan and Jeannie. I'll be more than happy to share them with you. So just back to what we were talking about, 29% of timeshare is now going to streaming music services, and that does include YouTube. Just if you're curious, the number one share of all of that streaming happens to be Pandora. I know there are Pandora people in the room. I know Pandora has taken a little bit of a beating in the press recently, but Pandora still has the number one share of listening when it comes to all of the particular services. And then there's AM/FM radio at 24%. Now, you'll notice that I've left iHeart and TuneIn and digital audio stations kind of on the side because it depends upon which audience I go see. If I went to a radio audience, they yell at me and say, put it in with AM/FM. If I go to a conference that's all about music streaming, they yell at me and say, put it all within the streaming. So there's a couple of points out there that can go either way depending upon which flavor of ice cream you like. There's downloads, which are 12%. And I will tell you that year over year, the most rapid decline that we're seeing in terms of changes of how we listen to music is actually in downloads. A lot of people think that it's radio. It's not. It's downloads. The same thing, and I'm sure you guys will show the sales trends for downloads. We're seeing it in terms of listening declines. Then there's CDs. A lot of CD listening still relates to the fact that the average car in the United States is about 12 years old. So even though I'm sure all of you are driving brand new Euro luxury cars, there's a lot of folks out there who are driving 2006 Vegas that still have a cassette player in them and a CD player. And then there's Sirius, and then there's all the other things that we can get, music choice, watching on MTV, and so on. So that's kind of the landscape from a listening standpoint. I think the really good news is we've been tracking for 20 years how many people are paying and what their expenditures are. This happens to go back about 10 years for 2006. For 2 years in a row, we've seen a recovery in the amount of spending in the ARPU that we're getting from our customers. And granted, it is a small number. Last year, 2016, it was only a 5% increase. And I think as Carrie Sherman from the RIAA has called it, it is a fragile recovery, and I couldn't agree more. But it is a recovery nonetheless. And after years of coming and giving these presentations where I would constantly report bad news, it is certainly a pleasure to start reporting some positive trends. So the number of paying customers is recovering. So too, as you'll see in a moment, is the amount that they're spending. Now, just speaking of spending, if you were in the business about 20 years ago, and these are RIAA numbers that I've inflation adjusted, the average person spent about $120 a year on music. Most of that was on CDs. And again, another seminar, this plays into the whole thing of why can't we get people to pay $120 a year for subscriptions, but that's probably a conversation for the cocktail party. So just remember the fact that we were spending $120 a year roughly 20 years ago. Right now, that number, and this includes vinyl, interactive subscriptions, CDs, and downloads, that number is $24. So you can see the dramatic decline in ARPU that's taken place over the last roughly 20 years. Now again, the good news, albeit, before I get to that, I just want to make some comparisons. If you're a working person and buy coffee, the report is, and these are not our numbers, so they're anecdotal, and you'll just have to trust me on that. You spend about $1,100 going to Starbucks on the way to work. So just to put that into context to what you're spending on music. If you live in a state where they sell lottery tickets, you're spending $300, and if you go to the movies, you're spending $43 on movie tickets. So you could see, we talk about music and the soundtrack of our life and how important it is and so on, but you could put the per capita spend relative to some of the other categories. Since some of you are economists, I do have to address the issue of compliments, and yes, we spend about $60 per capita on live, so that would take it up to about $84. But we also buy reduced turkey fat, sandwiches at Starbucks. We buy cigarettes. Some of us buy cigarettes when we buy our lottery tickets. And the $43 for movie tickets does include the price of popcorn and Diet Coke. But let's see. Again, on a positive perspective, year over year, after a few years of decline, and this only goes back to 2008 when it was $35 per capita. We're back up to $22. So we're moving in the right direction, but slowly. So the question for me is, how do we start accelerating that? How do we start accelerating that spend from rather than being up $2 to being up 3, 4, 5, 10, the kinds of trends some of you, if you're in music, were used to 20 or 30 years ago? And it all starts with what is really driving the growth in value of a customer is paid on-demand spending. This is Spotify Premium, this is Apple Music, this is Tidal, Amazon Music Unlimited. Last year, there was a 150% increase. This is 2016 over 2015, 150% increase in the number of people who are spending money on a paid subscription. Not sharing a subscription, reaching into their own wallet and having a monthly or an annual subscription. So it was up 150%. And by the way, these are, just to remind you, these are US numbers. Now, I'm pretty convinced when we look at this year-end this year, it's going to be somewhere between 32 and 35 million, where you're going to see really good growth. Forget about what Spotify and Apple are reporting. I'm convinced that we're going to see good growth in the category because if we look at our data in terms of people who are listening to paid on demand, whether or not they're paying or sharing an account, in January that number was 58 million. In June, it was 67 million. So we are seeing really good, we saw great growth in 2016, and we're seeing that growth continue to sustain itself through the first half of the year. So how big can big be? Look, I don't think we're ever going to have 200. People talk about why aren't we going to have 200 million people paying for streaming. I think it's really simple. Our goal as an industry should be to get to about 100 million. How do I get there? Well, the internet population is going to grow to about 240 million in the next 3 to 5 years. 80% of people will stream. We'll go from 75 to 80. Not everybody's going to stream. There is a big contingent out there who they're very content listening to AM, FM. They tend to be much older. There's a small group that really aren't still using the internet and smartphones. So let's use 80%. And by the way, you should be conscious that people share accounts. In the US, people are using there are about 2 users per account. For some services, it's a little higher. For some services, it's a little lower. But basically, you have to take all the numbers that you see and slice them in half. So right now, it's about 26 million. I'm guessing, let's round it, it's going to be about 100 million. So how do we get there? Well, first of all, there are a lot of people who are using free streaming services but not paid. In fact, if you take these numbers represent, and this is just monthly usage. This is not annual. This is average monthly usage. There's about 155 million streamers. That's the number all the way over on the left. About 151 million of them use a free service, and where that arrow is, you could see that 89 million are only using a free service. So there's a huge pool of people who need to be convinced to move from just using free to moving into the paid side of the ledger. And there's a lot of reasons. Some of it is economic. Some, as you'll see here, is they're very satisfied with the options that are out there. And I'm not going to get into a debate about, licensing and free services and free tiers and radio. But number one reason is that a lot of folks are just simply satisfied to listening to what they get on AM, FM radio, or they feel that there's enough free music streaming options, or the CD collection that they have is good enough. And there are even some people, if you look at the bottom, who say, hey, I'm okay with the ads on the free version. Right? So this all gets into the idea of segmentation. Not every music consumer is the same. And what we have to understand is that there's a lot of people who are very content with the free option. Our job, or my job as a marketer, is to change their mind and move them up the value chain. Some of the things that we see is consumers are really confused about what the offerings tend to come out and say, terrific, you're going to have 40 million songs, here you go. Can you imagine what it's like to try to deal with 40 million songs? Does anybody like us sit on a Saturday night and go, there's so much on Netflix, but I can't figure out what to watch? I mean, we're just kind of have this ocean of music that's out there. What consumers are really confused about, what they need our help in kind of sorting out the experience. So what are some of the things that they want? They want playlist sharing. They want family sharing like Netflix. They want ad-free on demand. They want to be able to skip back. What really surprising is that we already offer them as an industry a lot of the things that they want. We're just not marketing it. We're just not making them aware that the features that they're looking for are features that they can get in a paid on-demand experience. And when you think about the people who are paying to subscribe, that 26 million that I think is going to be 35, what motivates them? Well, unlimited number of songs. That doesn't mean 40 million. What that means is when I want to listen to something, whether it's mood music or jazz or pop or the top charts or this week's playlist, it's there and it's available for me. I want an on-demand experience. That's what I find is convenient, being able to pick my songs, pick my albums, pick my artists, and pick my genres. The third thing that's interesting is they like the idea of paid subscriptions. If you show me a Spotify user, a premium user, I guarantee they're much more likely to have Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime. These are people who buy into what I call the subscription ethos. So again, a lot of this is a little bit about segmentation. And just speaking of segmentation, just to give you a sense of some demographics, overwhelmingly, millennials are about half of the people who pay for a music service. And you can see 44% have an income of 100,000 plus. So this is still kind of a niche when you think about it from a demographic standpoint. Higher income, younger, boomers aren't really kind of participating. And just to give you a sense of, kind of more demographics, I think even though I'm sort of post-Woodstock generation, my suspicion is that Gen Z, the generation that's coming up, they may be the most music engaged ever. They may not go up to upstate New York and roll around in the mud, but because of technology, they're going to have all of the things at their hands. They're more likely, these are things that index more highly, so index over 100, I think you're all familiar with that concept. So Shazam and Spotify and Apple Music, they're also unfortunately pirating music, but they're more likely to buy artist merch. They're sharing recommendations. They want music everywhere they go. There's a lot of new music they want to buy. They're using their music apps. They're spending more time than others, and so on. If you'd like the chart, because there's a lot here. The point that I want to make is, fortunately, we now have a generation, my kids, who are certainly much more engaged and have much more use of the technology for music than even my generation did. Okay, so what kind of features do people want, right? Everybody's sitting in Silicon Valley trying to engineer the perfect service. The fact is that what consumers really want is something that's easy. They want an experience. It's got to be easy to navigate, easy to use in the car, easy to use on the phone, easy to customize. If you can make this easy, that's a lubricant, that's facility to get people to use the services. And as you see, easy to use in the car is very important. 66% of people say most of my music listening is in the car. And just to move a little bit to the car, AM/FM radio still dominates listening in the car. Only about 1 in 4 people are streaming in their car, because as you know, especially if you don't have a brand new car, it's relatively difficult to do. Streaming is only about 20%. But look what happens if you're now a paid streamer. There's another tipping point. Over half of what you're listening to is streaming. If you have a car that's relatively recent, if you have a car, one of the luxury makes from Europe, your likelihood of streaming is going to go through the roof. And just to give you an example, if you have a car that's from, the top bar is 2015 to 2017, 39% are streaming compared to somebody who's got an older car, it's only 17%. If you have an Audi, a BMW, Jaguar car like that, 70%, almost 70% are using the streaming in the car. And what do they want? They just want it to be easy. They want integration, they want voice, they want Wi-Fi. All of those things are, as I say, lubricants. Now, I think the car is the most important device, but as you all know, somebody's been talking about this thing called Alexa recently. So as I close, I'd be remiss in not talking about personal assistant devices. So just to close, we're doing a lot of research into this area, but just to give you a sense, these devices really have the potential to grow engagement for music. So for example, if you own one of these, and I just looked this morning at new data, it's about 10% of the population are now using them. 80% are rediscovering older music. 80% are listening to their streaming service more often. They're listening to their playlists more often. They're discovering music from new artists, and they're even listening to albums more often. So we know that this new technology is creating a much higher level of engagement. And with that, I'm going to say thank you and hand it to my colleague, Dave Bakula from Nielsen. Thank you. Do you want to step there?
If Dave's going to show slides, you're probably better off sitting in front. Russ, thanks very much for being exactly on time. as well as
Dave and Geoff know that is a first.
and second speaker is Dave Bakula, who is Senior Vice President of Global Product Leadership and Industry Insights for Nielsen Music. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you. Start. So the good news is I'm going to have a little bit in here that has a little bit of overlap with Russ, but luckily it says exactly the same thing. So we're going to just sit here and agree with each other and go, oh, you're so smart. No, you're so smart. No, stop it. You're smart. So what I wanted to look at today is just kind of the evolution and how this is changing. You know, I think we all kind of sit in this room and know that streaming is getting big. That nobody is sitting there going, streaming, what's a streaming thing? We all know it's big. We all know it's getting bigger. We all know it's the wave and it's the biggest part of the industry now. But there's a lot of things that are changing as sort of an accessory to that. We sit here and we'll talk about things like, well, you know, we used to buy CDs and everybody made $10 off of it. Then we used to buy tracks and everybody made $1 off of the track. And now we're doing this streaming thing and nobody's giving you money to stream something. Somebody's giving you money to listen to things, but it's not like, I want to stream this song, here's 2/3%. Now, can I listen to another one? Here's another 2/3%. It's not transactional thing anymore. So the way that this is changing, not just how we listen, how we monetize, there's also some other parts to it that are the way that the industry looks in the streaming world doesn't look exactly like it looks in mine. How do we focus on what the differences are between those and sort of capitalize on those? I'm actually going to go back to some of the things that Russ said as I go through here, so I'm going to kind of skip quickly through the first couple of things because I thought it was very important to talk about how much time is being spent on listening to music, and obviously Russ did as well. So again, just I broke out a little bit into some other categories that I think are important. Russ obviously mentioned some that are important as well. That total listening hours are going up, and the reason for that is that, as Russ mentioned, is two things. One, car accessibility. People have more opportunities to listen to streaming music in their cars. People have more opportunities because everybody's carrying around one of these things that has access to streaming music. So the points of consumption where we can actually go in and listen to more music are far greater than they ever have been before. Again, these are last year's. Unfortunately, we're in a period right now where we're 2 months away from having the 2017 data. But I think I would expect, and I'm sure Russ would say the same thing, that we expect that these numbers will continue to go up because the opportunities for listening just continue to go up. Same type of thing that Russ talked about here with how much time is being spent with different types of formats. Where are they listening? And same type of breakdowns, but exactly the same story. The listening spent on streaming is going up. Radio staying largely the same. Digital music libraries where we're really starting to see some decline. And people are not listening to as much of their own digital music library as they had before. And of course, physical is going down a little bit as well. Just a couple subgroup notes there. Teens still do spend a lot of time with their own digital music library, partly because maybe they don't have a subscription or they don't have a credit card to get a subscription or something like that. So there's free listening going on there, but there's still the iTunes gift card is still a very, very powerful tool in the industry. So they do own a lot of music as well. And millennials spending 21% of their time on on-demand audio streaming services. So they're very audio-driven and very on-demand streaming-driven as well. So that being said, I wanted to get into the numbers and the POS side of the business, or what used to be the POS side of the business and now is the streaming tracking side of the business, it seems. Here's where we're at through 31 weeks. I've updated this through the prior week ending, prior Friday. Through the first 31 weeks of the year, physical albums, digital tracks, streams, audio streams, the way that this breaks down, you can see the difference year over year in physical albums and digital albums. At the end of 2016, we saw something that we had never seen before in the music industry, and that's the fact that the physical business was actually not declining as fast as the digital side of the business. So digital, which came up, and we talked about Russ and I were talking about this a little bit before. If we would have come back here 10 years ago and said, hey, does anybody think digital albums are ever going to surpass physical albums? We probably would have all raised our hands and said, well, yeah, of course they will. They never did, and they never will. Digital albums are actually declining faster than physical albums now are at this point. So physical albums down about 17%, digital albums are down about 19% year over year. Total albums in whole down 17.5%. Digital tracks, of course, that's the one format where it's really, really been hard. The streaming, the conversion over to streaming has really replaced the need to buy digital tracks. There's still a couple formats that do fairly well on digital tracks, but for the most part, this new normal world is about 20 to 25% down in digital tracks year over year. The streaming piece, the audio-on-demand streaming piece, 222.5 billion. We're going to hit 400 billion streams just for audio-on-demand this year. You're going to see that in a couple seconds because I got a projection in here. Yeah, this is just US, yep. Up 61% year over year in audio-on-demand streams. That's going to equate to a bigger gain in total units year over year than it was last year. And I think last year we all kind of said 100% up was about the number, 90 to 100% up was the number. And so it's going to be 61% up this year, but it's 61% up off of a number that is hundreds of billions of streams. So we're actually adding more streams than we were last year. It's just that the base is getting ridiculously big. So 9.7% up is where we are right now. Be very, very interested to see where Josh and the RIAA and where the numbers end up for the mid-year, because it looks like more good news again. And it was great news at the end of 2016. Not great news. It was very good news at the end of 2016. There's still some work we need to do. We know.
Optimistic.
I didn't mean great. We're cautiously optimistic, exactly. But ownership, when you take all the ownership pieces, albums, tracks, digital, physical, you name it, ownership down about 19% and access up 61%. So here's where the forecast is for the rest of the year. And this is based on nothing more than me doing a very little bit of math. Physical albums will probably recover a little bit. I don't know if anybody remembers how great Q4 was last year. If you don't, it's because it wasn't. Q4 was really not a very good release period for albums last year. So if we do get a Taylor Swift, if we do get somebody with a very big name, instantly going to be better than last year, because last year the biggest album I think in Q4 was the Pentatonix Holiday album, which, hey, look, it's a great album at a great time of the year, but doesn't really carry over a lot of love into January, unfortunately. Digital albums will be down about 18%, total albums down about 17%. Digital tracks really floating right around where it is. By the time we're 31 weeks into the year, digital tracks are pretty predictable for the rest of the year. And audio-on-demand streaming will probably end up about 60%, which means for the year we'll end up about 11% up year over year, which is a really nice number, a nice double-digit gain, and probably a little bit more than that when we take in some of the other parts of the industry. So how did we get here? Audio-on-demand streaming. If we do an estimate of where we just landed there, audio-on-demand streaming is going to be about 55% of the business this year. That took 6 years to go from 1%, basically not even on the map, to 55%, where it is not just the majority, but bigger than some of these other formats had ever been, going back to even the pre-digital days. I'm going to go back a little bit further than this to see how big, even when it was all physical, how big it was for physical, and how long ago it was that one format had this much of a majority within the industry. But you can see even 2013 or so, it wasn't even double digits yet. To get up to 55% by the end of this year, really pretty remarkable. The other thing I wanted to do is I kind of stretched this out a little bit. I took some of the other numbers out, but I left the digital ownership numbers in. I wanted to look at kind of the rise and the fall of digital ownership, because it did come up very quickly, and it seems to be deteriorating and disappearing almost as quickly as it came up. You can see back in 2004, digital sales were almost nothing. Streaming wasn't even really on the map yet at that point, not legal streaming at least. And you got up to about 2011, 2012, where you were getting 44, 43, 45% of the business coming from digital ownership. But then very quickly as streaming came up and grew, the digital ownership piece really declined quite quickly, down to 25% if you combine digital albums and digital tracks right now. So kind of going right back to where it was, right around 2007, 2008, not even 2008, 2007 really, levels of where we're at with digital tracks and digital albums right now. So, like I said before, how has this kind of taken the industry as we knew it, and what was big here and what did really well here is not necessarily what's doing really well here. Yeah, question?
Just a clarifying question about
Not a problem.
when you compare on-demand streams to album equivalents.
Yep.
What's the methodology?
Yeah, the methodology, and that's always a point of debate, I guess, is everybody who's done it here is I see smiling and laughing that I'm the one that has to answer this question. So, yeah, because like I said, it's not a transactional thing. I'm not handing you 2/3 of a penny. What we do really is kind of take take numbers that we know from the industry. Josh will be very familiar with this. We've talked about it a million times. That we know that there's a monetary value that comes into the industry. Let's say it's $100. Let's say 10 people stream for 1 month each, and $100 comes into the industry. And they listen to 10 songs. Everybody listens to one song. That value divided by that number of listens, basically, backs us into what that monetary value is. So it's fairly easy for people to say, CD or album, $10. Yeah, that sounds about right. It's somewhere in the ballpark. Track, about $1. Okay, I can live with that, about $1. Stream, 2/3 of a penny, getting probably better because I'm just looking at audio on demand here. As everybody laughs again, I'm not counting video in here for a very good reason because I don't want to get into a debate of what the difference between 0.18 and 0.2 is. But that's kind of the world that we live in, is that the on-demand premium audio subscription is getting better. It's benefiting from Apple coming in and being pure premium. It's benefiting from Amazon getting much more popular. It's benefiting from people converting from Spotify over Spotify ad-supported to Spotify Premium. So as more people come in, that's where, and look, no offense to YouTube Red, but video doesn't really have a premium component. So it's hard to convert people over to a premium subscription type of a model in video, whereas with audio, super easy. In fact, more often than not, they're in a service that is a premium service. Basically, yeah. Yep. Yep.
Yep. And then I switched to Spotify Premium. All of a sudden, even though I'm listening to the same number of songs, you're counting it as more.
Because you're bringing more revenue in than you would in an ad-supported environment. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And it's part of it too. And Geoff will knows this very well. That there's a little bit of a consumer engagement level there where you have to sort of jam these things together for charts. Hot 100, Billboard 200, those things are all sort of combined as well. And to say, it's probably mostly based on revenue and monetization and partially just based on consumption, like how much is actually going on out there in the ratio between the two. I know, Josh, you guys use a formula for gold and platinum that's very similar to that. Not similar to the number, but similar to the methodology. So again, how has this sort of changed? So what I wanted to look at here, I just took the 6 biggest genres right now because it's all I could really fit on the page. And I wanted to look at physical albums, digital song downloads, permanent downloads, and on-demand audio streams. And what we're looking at here is what percentage of the format is coming from a particular genre. So you would read this as rock is 42.9% of all physical album sales, which in fact it is. And that's a crazy number. So we go back to the days of physical album sales. We go back to those halcyon days, as Russ said, of the late 90s, early 2000s, where we were buying 785 million CDs in the US at the peak. And you look at that world, and rock is the driver there. No doubt about it. The Beatles, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, all of those things do extremely well on physical albums. But even when that consumer jumps over to digital, they're still buying albums. They still want the whole thing. Don't give me Dark Side. I don't want to hear Brain Damage. I want to hear Dark Side of the Moon. I want the whole thing. So it's still a very album-focused consumer. What we're not seeing, however, is that translating over into streaming just yet. And that's the piece where, as the industry shifts over into streaming, rock is that's not the flag bearer. That's not the one where everybody goes, yep, I'm going to go and listen to a bunch of rock. They're still buying a lot of rock, but when you look at streaming, it's not hard to see, R&B hip-hop is the place where it is. It's no surprise that people like Drake and Kanye and Rihanna and Beyonce have these such deep engagements with some of these streaming companies. So it's not just changing how we're listening, it's changing what is actually being listened to out there. You look at, even the charts show it every single week they show it. I can't believe that there's still 5 Drake albums in the top 200 on Billboard, yet I look at the album chart and there's not a single Drake album on there. His best-selling album last week, I think, sold 1,300 units or something like that, which is nowhere near getting into the top 200 albums, but he gets millions and millions and millions and millions of streams. He said he's got almost 100 billion streams, 100 million streams this year, 100 billion streams this year, where he's sold, I want to say, in the most recent week, he had about 100 million streams,
and he sold about 5,000 albums. So people aren't going out and saying, gotta have that Drake album, but they are going in and saying, I gotta listen to it, and again, and again, and again, and again, and every single time it's bringing more monetization and more exposure and more market share to Drake and his labels. So, doing obviously very, very well in R&B hip hop, and there's a great reason why. Some of the streaming services differ a little bit in what they are sort of focusing on. You get a little bit of a different consumer base with Amazon than you would with Apple, than you would with Spotify, certainly. So they all kind of know where their places are, and they're all doing very well within their constituent parts. Pop, still songs. People want to own that big pop song. There's still 100,000 people every single week going out and buying Despacito right now. Even though it's the most streamed song of all time, it's also the most sold song on a weekly basis, and it's better than number 2 and number 3 combined every single week. This thing is just huge, and people want to buy it and own it. Country, and we've had this conversation a lot of times, the country piece was very, very slow to pick up digital ownership. They're very, very, very slow to pick up streaming, certainly on-demand streaming like this. They do fairly well at Pandora. I don't know if you've got any Pandora. I've just talked anecdotally with them. But they say the country does very well with programmed streaming. And I know I love country. I want to get country pushed to me. They do very, very well. When it comes to on-demand, that's one thing where it's like, okay, now it's not necessarily a format or it's not necessarily a point of consumption, but it's the type of consumer that says, yes, I love country and I want to listen to it, and I am perfectly digital and perfectly capable, but I don't want to pick it myself. And Pandora does a great job, and they're going to do it for me, and I'm happy. So still even slower to kind of catch up on the streaming side of the business. EDM is almost converting over to pure digital. There's not very much going on in EDM on physical. And Latin is another piece. Now, we were only looking at audio here, but Latin streaming, it's out of this world on YouTube. It's just off the charts on YouTube. About 80% of Latin streaming comes from YouTube. And where they are about 2 to 2.5% of sales, they're about 10 to 12% of video streaming for Latin music. So again, that type of consumer, very, very prone to streaming a lot of music. The other thing I wanted to look at is and I've said this a few times, and Russ has probably heard it a million times when we've been on panels together, is this concept of binge listening and what's going on out there with people going back and saying, you know what, I love this song, and look, there it is right next to 4 other songs. I don't even know what album they're on. It's sort of like the way I watch television. I have no idea what station my favorite TV shows are on. I have no idea what time they're on. I just know that every day when I get an alert that it says it's on my Hulu, I can go and watch it. And that's a little bit the way that some of these songs are, some of these catalog songs, which are, and I kind of put discovering in quotes here because they're going back and consuming this catalog content where maybe they've never heard it before. It's maybe brand new to them. It's certainly cataloged from the way that we look at it from the industry. We're not working it at radio. We're not throwing against a bunch of marketing dollars against it. But they're going back and saying, hey, look, there's this great song by Drake. Oh, what do you mean he's got all these other albums? Well, I'm going to go back and listen to them. Or I'm just going to take the top 10 songs and I have no idea what they're on, but I'm going to go back and listen to them. So the catalog part of the business is much, much higher, and I'm using Drake as an example here, knowing full well that R&B hip-hop actually does about the same on sales as it does on catalog for current and catalog. But if you look at it overall, a higher percentage of catalog, this is the percentage of the genre that is catalog, so anything that's a song that's more than 18 months old. So for overall, you got about 59% of the album sales that are catalog, about 63% of the streams. But look at it for rock. I mean, we know 2/3 of the sales are going to be catalog for rock, but how about 88% of the streams coming from catalog? Not a lot of people going in and saying, I want to listen to the new Foo Fighters, Imagine Dragons, whatever it is. They're going back and they're listening to the catalog rock at a much, much higher percentage than they are for album sales. R&B hip-hop, pretty close to the same, a little bit more catalog on song sales, but really pretty close on sales and streams. Pop, much more catalog driven, especially a genre like that that's so current. To see 2/3 of the consumption in pop being songs over 18 months old. Country, again, another one. The other interesting thing about country is the genre that is the most heavily audio versus video. They have the lowest percentage of the major genres that are video streams versus audio streams, about 70-30, 70% audio streams and about 30% video streams. So country is a very audio-driven consumer. It's also a very catalog-driven consumer. And country, like I said, country doesn't do great, but there are certain artists that do fantastic. Sam Hunt, always going to do great at streaming. There was a great push at the very beginning. Spotify was on board right away. They promoted it very well. And Sam Hunt's new song is just killing it at streaming. Again, it's another one of those things where the number one is bigger than like 2, 3, and 4 combined. So that continues to do well. And then of course the Latin part, as we talked a little bit about before. Some of the, one other thing that I wanted to look at here is the different types of consumer. In the purple, you've got the buyer, and in the blue, you've got the streamer. And what we've done here is we've taken kind of the ethnic background and Hispanic identification on the left-hand side, left-hand side, the age in the middle, and where they live, the type of residence. And what we're seeing, of course, is that this is being dominated. The numbers, the percentages are there. The indexes are the numbers that are next to them there. So you can see the indexes for African American and Native American and Hispanic, very, very high, as Russ mentioned as well. The Hispanic index is very high there. The age, not surprising, exactly what Russ said, the millennials. The 18 to 24s, the 25 to 34s are the main drivers there. And then as you get old dudes like me, it's much more focused on buying. The type of residence really within the cities. What you're going to see there, and the next slide I'm going to show kind of just by market how streaming is sort of coming up. We did, and it's really focused around obviously major urban areas and college towns for the most part. Taking a look at the 210 Nielsen markets that we have here and taking basically indexing it against the total population within those markets. You can see the top 10 DMAs by index, not surprising. College towns and very technologically forward towns, Denver, San Francisco, Dallas, LA, Seattle, Salt Lake City, even in the top 10 there, Austin, these other markets that are very strong. I think what I'm trying to get at here, and it's kind of what Russ wanted to get at, I think as well in some of his slides, was that there's a lot left to be gained here. We are nowhere near done. We are nowhere near saturated. We are nowhere near, wow, where are we going to find that next 10,000 streamers? We've got a ton of room for growth here. And you can see in these markets in the middle where it's way under indexing to the population that we have a lot of area to get these people converted over. And how do you do that? Russ said exactly what we need to do to get these people to convert over into premium streams. We're making it more worthwhile to them. They're spending more time on it. They're getting more engaged, and it's giving them a better sense of satisfaction with the services. So that will continue to move us all over. Mary Meeker from Kleiner Perkins put together a great slide for her code, and I just swiped it because I knew it was going to be right in front of my friends from the RIAA here, and it's all their data. But I thought it was really great, the thing that I took away from it was really the top line, which is after 16 years of minus 4% average annual growth, we had a nice 11% gain last year, and looking to do that again. So look at where this goes all the way back to 1973 when gas shortages and things like that, and 20% interest rates. But look at how we are now kind of back on the road to recovery. I'm not going to say that this is going to last forever or go on indefinitely, or certainly ever get to the point where we were at 2000. I hope it does, because I think we're all here because we love this industry and we want to be carried out from it feet first. But this is really good news after a pretty long run of down numbers. So I'm excited. I hope everybody really feels the excitement and the opportunity that we have here, because I think in terms of streaming, I don't think we're anywhere near the end. I think we have a long way to go. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Dave. Next up is Geoff Mayfield. Geoff, looks to me, has worked almost everywhere at Billboard, Universal Music Group, and he's going to talk about some of the work that he has been doing together with Buzz Engel.
While we're warming up, I had this big challenge. I was just invited to join you recently. The speaker in this slot was supposed to be Jim Ledestri. He's the founder and CEO of the company Buzz Engel, who I'm representing today, but he was unable to make it. So I said to him, well, listen, I can do this, but only on one condition. Can I follow someone who's really experienced at speaking to the audiences like this and who has a lot of background talking about stuff? And he said, yeah, we can work that out for you. So I had the pleasure. I said, once I realized that Dave was going to be here before me, then I said, okay, I can do this. I can do this. So I'm going to take you back. I'm trying to figure, one of the challenges would be a lot of the data that we measure, and I'll tell you more about the company later on. A lot of the same data that we measure is stuff that Nielsen measures as well. So I thought, well, what could I do? And the obvious thing was to show you the same stuff, but in different colors and different fonts. Different graphs. That's not really what's going to happen. I'm going to take you on a voyage. I'm really excited about the fact that there is such a thing as the Music Industry Research Association. A lot of the people, a lot of the familiar voices and faces I see here are people that I've known from my Billboard days. I was there for about 20 years. When I first got to Billboard, if you did a concentric circle of music industry and data, they didn't mesh. They really, and part of that was there wasn't a lot of data to have. I'll give you an early example. 1987. Now, we have this big concern. At the beginning of the 80s, you kind of had this thing where it was a baseline study, if you will. They still made singles, but they made them in a configuration that the singles buyer would not buy. They were making 45s. They were making these things called records. And the kids who most likely would buy a single, they listened to this little box called a cassette. So things weren't matching up, but they'd still make them. They'd still send them out to stores. The stores would send them back. So for a period of time, you almost had like this inadvertent test case of what would it be like if we never had singles. Well, eventually there were a couple of attempts at a cassette single, but the second one was launched in 1987, and as soon as it worked well, you started to have some debates within record companies. Are we cannibalizing the albums which we'd prefer to sell because of the fact that we're putting the individual singles, the hit singles out on sale? Well, the fact is, singles probably always did cannibalize albums to some extent, but you never had to worry about it because you never had a market where they got subtracted and then got put back in. The problem with all the debates that record company executives had about whether or not it was a good thing that singles were selling again is the fact that they had no data. 1987, this would have been a period where the largest of the six, there were 6 distributors then, the largest of the 6 distributors only had barcodes on a portion of their inventory. One of the 6 majors, yeah, we have barcodes. They're European barcodes. We're sorry. So, you really didn't have organized data, and that's okay because only the largest retailer had complete point of sale deployed all over the place. So there were only so many people who could have taken advantage of it. Everyone was ramping up to have point of sale, but in those days, the company that Dave works with and that I work with, we wouldn't have had the tools we need to measure that. So they had a lot of arguments, but they weren't able to come to any conclusions. We'll go a little bit later. Now we're getting into the data era. SoundScan had already launched at this point. There's another context I'd like to give to you here. There was a bad crash in the early 80s for the music industry. There had been a really robust 70s, part of it fed by disco, a lot of it fed by Saturday Night Fever and the Grease soundtrack. But it wasn't just that music. There was some rock that did really well. Then after that, there were a combination of factors that caused the industry to hit some rough times in the early 80s. So then we start this climb. The CD helped, MTV helped, and by one measure or another, if you look at RIAA ship, if you look at RIAA value, if you look at Nielsen numbers, one way or another, there was actually a growth period stitched together of 18 years. But in the middle of that 18-year growth period, there was this one year where the growth was modest instead of robust. I gave you RIAA numbers, but the numbers from SoundScan, which was the earlier incarnation of Nielsen Music, would have said the same thing. So the industry started to panic a little bit, not like they would in the beginning of this century, but there was a bit of a panic. And so what they did was, how are we going to figure out why the numbers are slowing down? And in that case, they resorted to market research. You really couldn't tell from looking at transactions why things were slowing down. So they looked at market research. There was a joint study, what's now called the Music Business Association, was then called NARM. They did a joint study with RIAA. And they went to the consumer, and one of the conclusions they came up with is, you know what? There's a lot of albums. Now we're going back to that old debate about whether or not singles cannibalize albums. There's a lot of albums out there that only have 1 or 2 good songs, and I don't care for the whole album. You're trying to make me buy the whole album. So that was a case where research was deployed smartly. Here's another misadventure with data, and by now, we have a lot of tools to track things. We're going to 2008. Kid Rock's album comes out. I think the album actually came out in 2007, and it debuted at #1. And then, as a lot of albums did in that period, it was in the top 10 for a couple of weeks, slid down, kind of disappeared. All of a sudden, the album comes back. And that's when people start realizing, you know what? I can't buy this album at iTunes. I can't buy this hit single that's on this album at iTunes. And all of a sudden, there was a lot of discussion, and a few executives say, hey, you want to get good numbers again? Get away from these newfangled digital thingies. We're just going to have albums. So believe me, a lot of people took a look at this and said, hey, the way we can get future sales is to be back in the dark ages where we didn't have digital distribution. So there was a lot of celebration, but if you look deeper at it, the whole thing that made it happen, it was this old-fashioned thing called a hit single. Unlike a lot of albums, this one had a hit single that came out weeks after it came out. It was like one of the songs of the summer. In fact, it was called All Summer Long. And that was really the catalyst. So you had a lot of people saying, hey, look, no downloads. We're really doing something here. But in fact, it was a hit single, that old-fashioned contraption called a hit single. That's really what caused it. Now, here's what happened. They're not selling the song on iTunes. They're not selling the album on iTunes. You know who is selling the song on iTunes? A lot of satellite groups. So if you looked at the revenue, just that we could tell they were getting from the track sales at iTunes and Amazon MP3 store, you could tell that there was people were buying that instead of buying the real thing. Then you try to estimate what would they have done. This was a big, robust market for ringtones at this time. So what did they lose on that? So we figure conservatively they left at least $1 million on the table. Now, I want to just set the table. How many of you here are aware of a thing called buzz angle? Okay, for those of you who don't know, it's a newer company, daily processing, which means we have fresh data for you every day, deep filtering. If you've got time, you can literally run more than 10 trillion different combinations of reports. If you need to find out what vinyl is selling on avant-garde jazz in Wisconsin, you can. There was retailer breakdowns, big, really deep mapping on genres, comprehensive dashboard and filtering. It's a global system. Right now, if you look at it, you can see activity, if you wish, in both the US and Canada, and as other territories are ramped in, then they will be in the same view, if you wish. Big data architecture. I've mentioned the daily data. Okay, if you want this deck, I'll send it to you. This is very similar to what we had before. Here's one. No truncation or aggregation, and every transaction is available. So sometimes in other systems, if something's merged, you kind of lose the detail. You also get zip code level reporting if you need it. And so it's just a very deep system for anyone who's trying to look in a very analytical fashion. Responsive interface. User defined. I'm trying very hard not to sound like a commercial here because you guys didn't come here to hear a commercial. This is an idea of what the screen looks like, and now that I've oriented you into that, I wanted to give you just one quick look at the kind of case study that you can pull with this system. This is looking at the different Super Bowl spikes that have happened over the years. And because of the fact that there's daily reporting, you can see what happens the day of the event and what happens in the days that follow. A couple of conclusions you can draw from it quickly if you're good with colors is that it helps some artists more than others, and it wouldn't be a bad thing for someone like Lady Gaga, wouldn't be a bad thing for Bruno Mars. And even you look at Coldplay, a lot of people kind of gave Coldplay flack for being picked for the Super Bowl, but overall they actually got a pretty good rise out of it as well. A little bit different angle of data than what Dave showed you, but this is showing the album consumption by release period, and it's kind of getting into one of the things that Dave referred to. It's a different way of looking at the same thing that Dave referred to, and that is it's getting harder and harder to get traction for newer music. In this age of consumption that's driven by streaming, people are going for comfort food, going for music they listened to in college, going to music that they listened to when they were kids. They're not necessarily out there to explore and find the new artists who might intrigue them. So it's getting harder and harder as an industry. The difference here between new and recent, those are two categories of what you've come to know as current. But new is during the first 7 weeks of an album's life. And then anything between the 8th week and a year and a half, which is the demarcation for catalog, would be in the recent category. Then we have catalog and deep catalog broken down as well. Catalog being that demarcation at a year and a half, 18 months. And then between that and 3 years, that's what we were listing there as catalog. Deep catalog is what we have is anything 3 years and older. So as you can see, there was a decline there, but only 14.9% of music consumption. And that's everything. That's not just albums. It's everything, streaming, what have you, song sales, and a real small representation and down from what it was the year prior. Now let's look at what happens when you look at that by channel. And albums, it's 22.7%, so a little bit more robust than that average that I showed you. But song sales, almost 11%, 8.5% on audio streams. Video streams, that's people my age and older sharing the stuff on from YouTube on their Facebook page. A week like this, when someone adored like Glenn Campbell dies, there's a lot of that activity going on. So as you can see, the axis gets thrown more and more to a catalog when you get to those song-centric media. And we're living in a song-centric world. Doesn't mean the album's over, doesn't mean the album's not important, but we're living in a song-centric environment. This is a view at what's happening with, it's something that we've known for a while. People first were alarmed, before digital, people were alarmed when they realized how many albums a year came out. You know, the idea that there could be 27,000 albums put out a year, or 30,000 albums a year, or 33,000 albums a year, that blew people's minds. But that was back in the days when you actually had to make them. Once you got to digital, that number very quickly got to 60,000, and I think, you know, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So, you know, when you can just record very cheaply and get to market very easily, there's more and more titles. But still, that same principle that we saw when we first became alarmed at how much stuff there is to choose from, it's still a minority of titles. So 36% of the activity in album sales is coming from your top 500 sellers. And a significant percentage, 13%, is coming from just the top 50 alone. And then when you get up to the larger universe and you get to lower in the report, it means less and less in consumption from album sales point of view. From a song sales point of view, a little bit different. 9% and 26% within that top 500. And what really changes when you get into song streams. And that's where that hopeful thing that we heard about called the long tail, which didn't really look to be that significant in the physical world, and wasn't really amplified as much by digital downloads as everyone kind of hoped it would be. It's starting to become more of a way of doing business in the streaming world. You want to think about how the value of data is proved. Think about at least 3 companies that have sold in the last few years. By the way, I see people taking photos. I'll make the same offer Russ did. You're welcome to take photos, but goodness, I wouldn't want to see that. But if you want, I'll go ahead and send you the deck. You can get a hold of me through Alan, or you can find me on LinkedIn, or you can come over to Pasadena. But at any rate, I'll be more than happy to share the deck with you. But here's 3 different transactions that have happened in less than 2 years' time, and in the not too distant past, where data companies were sought to be great acquisitions. And it's just the fact that now those first 2 numbers are reported, and I don't know, 100 million? No, that's actually a mistake. It was 50 million for Echo Nest. I don't know where that came from. 50 million for Music Metric, and we're thinking about 55 million for Next Big Sound. But at any rate, it gives you an idea of what the value of a data company can be. Here's a cautionary note for those of you who work with data. Every top music executive pledges allegiance to data. But here's what I want you to think about. Go back to when downloads first started to happen. We were all happy about the fact that now the internet was a place where you buy music instead of steal music. and then Warner Brothers, I have to give them credit. Warner Music came out as, we're the tech-friendly music company. And I thought, well, who in the world? What I want to find out is that dog bites man, or that man bites dog, rather. I wanted to find the music executive who wasn't interested in the advantage that technology could bring to the music industry. So, the idea that you will read in the paper where someone says, we are a data-driven company. The thing you need to understand is the senior managers at some of the music, they want to be data-driven, and they will tell you that they're data-driven, but they tend to favor data that agrees with their own notions, and they will sometimes make key decisions based on the wrong set of data. They might make a decision based on market research that might be better answered by the transactions of their trading partners. So it's kind of a sticky thing. I'll give you one example. And I won't mention any names because one of the hats I wear is freelance consultant, and I don't want to turn off any customers before they hire me. But I know of one executive who was convinced he'd seen the success of Susan Boyle, success of Josh Groban, Michael Bublé, and decided, boy, the adult music business would be a great business to be in, and had a lot of data pulled on everyone from Michael McDonald to Barbra Streisand, what have you. The problem with that is, yeah, you can find some great data, but what you don't have is the failure rate. You don't have all the artists who were signed who tried to reach that older consumer who didn't connect. Sure enough, data helped sell this person on the notion that, you know what, we really should be in this business. Millions were spent, and it didn't work out as well as had been hoped. The other thing I would say is there is someone smart, really smart, who deals with data at every single record company, but sometimes their opinions may or may not be heard. A&R is an area that was resistant to data. If you would have gone to an A&R department 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, and said, hey, we've got some tools here that really could help you, they were reluctant to do that. And now, I know in particular the R&B department, believe it or not, at Warner Brothers Music, this is an area where you wouldn't have necessarily thought that would be the case, but they are very data-driven. More and more A&R departments are paying attention to all the different hints you can collect from social media, YouTube, what have you, and therefore there's more and more decisions that are being driven in A&R by data. But here's the thing I'm concerned about, even as someone who has benefited from and been a proponent of data from the beginning. I showed you, I was there when there wasn't any data. The thing I'm concerned about is there's some smart people who think, well, we'll never make any A&R mistakes because we've got data. And that kind of scares me, because I think an industry that makes all of its creative decisions based on data alone is going to miss the thing that really excites someone who really cuts through the clutter and goes from the heart. And I'll give you a great example of that to close. This woman here. I'm sorry. If you can show me any data from when her first album came out that suggests that a Zoftig woman from the UK who sings soulfully, sings almost R&B type music, would connect with a young audience and then later an older audience the way that she did. If you would have told me that from what you saw selling, what you saw on YouTube, what you might have found on market research, I can't think of any data that would have convinced a record label to sign her, and yet someone found her, and thank God, because she has made millions for the industry and shattered sales records with her last 2 albums. So data is a wonderful tool, but the thing I worry about sometimes is that, it's not going to solve every mistake, and sometimes you got to go with the gut as well. Thank you for your attention.
Jeff, stay up on the stage. We have a little over 15 minutes for questions, so I want to invite each of the presenters back up. And while you're thinking of questions, let me ask the first one. It's exciting to see the industry turning around after so many years on a downward trajectory, and hopefully that will continue. And as was emphasized, the streaming is also generating huge volumes of data. What are the areas that you would say where we really lack data and we could still do better in terms of trying to understand the problems the industry faces, the opportunities in the industry? You know, if you had a magic wand and could collect additional data, how would you go about it? Start with Dave, who seemed enthusiastic.
I mean, I've got a couple that drive me crazy on a regular basis because at my heart, I'm still just an analyst at a music company. I want to make the industry healthy. One thing that I think I miss the most from my days at the distribution company, you'd probably agree, is customer level data. You know, where Apple has their customers and Spotify has their customers and Amazon has their customers, and they each know what they do in their own ecosystem. But it's very hard, and you're probably the closest to being able to get that broad view through all the market research. But to be able to say this customer at Amazon is also this customer at Apple is also this customer at Spotify would be incredibly powerful to see how they react, how they go one place for one thing. We used to do, you'll probably remember the days we did market basket analysis for Walmart and Target and things like that. And to be able to see, hey, this person who was in this particular Nielsen panel bought country music over here and then they bought rock music over here. And why would they do those things? And Walmart and Target love that. And the digital groups just don't have that.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. You know, coming out of packaged goods and actually having spent part of my career at Nielsen, the connection that, for example, the CPG market has, pharmaceutical market has, with their consumer and understanding the segmentation and being much closer to what they're doing and thinking and believing and what will motivate them. Yeah, I think that's a bit of a blind spot in the music industry. And by the way, I worry, and maybe Geoff may have hit on this tangentially, I worry that all of the money is being put into data analytics and playlisting and all of that and being siphoned away from that area.
There's also some data that I think would be helpful, but isn't going to be easily mined. Companies like Apple and Amazon who really make their living by analyzing their consumers. There's only so much they share. They do give consumer level data to the trading partners, as they've alluded to, but there's always some data that, you know, people would love to know what did the consumer skip when they were at Spotify, or what did they skip when they were at Apple Music. And, you know, I'm not complaining about it, but you know, that is data that decision makers would love to get their hands on that they're not going to be able to get their hands on. And I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Can I ask you, then we'll open it up. Do the artists have a much better sense of who their consumers are today than they did 30 years ago?
I think they have the tools to, but the problem, I think, is we do this stuff for a living. There's no artist out there who's got the time to look at data the way that the three of us and probably all of us in this room have. So is even the most successful artist, or maybe the most successful artist manager who has multiple successful artists, do they have an analyst on staff that can say, hey, we just saw this number and you've got to go reroute your tour into this market because that's how great you're doing over here?
I'll give you a plus and minus on that. I was intrigued. A friend of mine worked at Atlantic Records when the Rolling Stones were being sold through that label. And Mick Jagger knew not only that there was a company called a Rack Jobber, he knew their names, and he knew that they sold more cassettes than they did vinyl. And if he saw that, like, the number was light at a company that puts music in the department stores, it was a point of concern for him. So, you know, he's probably the exception, but he knew his business that well.
He went to the London School of Economics, I want you to know.
And there are artists out there that are that interested in it, and not surprisingly and not coincidentally at all, they're some of the most successful artists. Garth Brooks wants to see every single number that he can get to on his stuff.
And maybe we need to bring it up a level. Maybe it's not necessarily the artist, because we're asking an awful lot of artists, you know, writing, singing, playing, DJ, you know, being social. I mean, God, it's a burden to be an artist these days. But certainly the management companies. I mean, if you're working with a William Morris, or if you're working with a Vector Mark, those people need to be able to bring that to you for guidance.
On the other end of the Mick Jagger, though, there was a rock band on Interscope, and I can't remember, but when I was at Universal, they had a rock band that wasn't really cracking the way they thought it would based on the music they were doing. And one of the questions that kicked around is it because our lead singer wears a dress that we're not clicking with our bass as much as we could? So that's not an answer we could fix by looking at data from Amazon or Apple. So we did a market research study, and what we came back with was, yeah, it did turn off some potential fans, and the band didn't care. This guy wanted to wear a dress. So, sometimes they get the answer and they don't necessarily do anything.
I'm not going near that.
Ahead of his time, apparently.
Well, no, that's why I had the pink tank top. Yeah.
If you have questions, why don't you raise your hand? Dave?
So Geoff, you posed this interesting question of whether singles cannibalize albums. You showed some data from 94 and 95, and I didn't understand your answer to the question. Could you explain again what the idea was?
Well, we don't have to worry about it anymore because since Apple came on the market with iTunes, it wasn't a debate anymore. But there was from about the time that the cassette single first happened, there became this concern. The most played song of the year wasn't available as a single one year, no doubt. Had the biggest song of the year, had the most radio play, most audience. And it was never sold as a single because they wanted you to buy the album instead. So more and more albums were being released without the biggest songs being released as singles. And being on the Hot 100 wasn't as big a motivator for some bands as it had been before. So we had to change, when I was at Billboard, we had to change the way we did the Hot 100. And that was one of the reasons why. So there was always this debate. When Doug Morris was still at Universal, and this is before I worked with them, if one of their labels put out a single by one of these bands that might be one of those 1 or 2 hit wonders, they'd get a call from on high. Because, and I understand, when you're in Doug Morris's world, you think that there's actually kids that'll pay $15 to buy the one song they want. So there was a disconnect between that level and where the consumer actually was.
Joel?
So I really enjoyed all 3 presentations, and I know they weren't advertising, but unfortunately it worked. Now, I'm a university professor, so I don't have any money, but I want to make a public interest case for getting your data out to researchers. This is an industry that's facing all kinds of public policy challenges, and having third-party research from disinterested parties would really be helpful to the industry. So figuring out some way to give me a discount.
Yeah.
I'll give you a card.
We do stuff like that all the time too. Yeah.
I know, but usually the Nielsen stuff, $6,000 for one song at a time, and it's just not that useful.
Oh, I don't.
So
That's $4,500.
I don't believe that.
But actual research.
Nobody's. If that were the case, I'd be retired.
Pretty cool. Advertising work.
Part of Joel, as you know, part of the reason for forming our association is to try to provide more access to data, which I think would be good for the whole industry, good for the companies that collect the data as well. More people will use it, I think, more advertising, there'll be additional demand. So that's a conversation I think we should continue and not try to pressure them too much publicly.
No, but I'll go on record in saying, because I know we've, back in the days when we were doing a lot of peer-to-peer work, we provided that for academic papers. Personally, I'm happy to do it so long as it doesn't impact the commercial. So as you think about this, Alan, as an organization, so long as it doesn't impact, the commercial trajectory of our companies, we absolutely should be doing it. I mean, I was speaking for myself.
Yeah. One of the things that we can do is facilitate by having kind of standardized memorandums of understanding so that the researchers won't use it for purposes that it wasn't provided or for competing with the companies that provided it. Another thing which hadn't occurred to me before is that Mira could actually help with the question that came up, which is we're siloed. We have information from Apple, Absolutely. We have information from Amazon and from Pandora, but we don't merge them together. So we probably don't know how many people are using multiple services and things like that. So that, I can imagine some fancy econometrics that might help under some assumptions to kind of learn about what the intersection looks like, but that's probably one area where we might be able to serve a role as well. Yes?
Thank you for the presentations. From all 3, we saw that use is increasing, and there's a challenge here of monetizing this use. I want to ask if you have any ideas to share about the associated challenge of distributing these fans after they've been monetized, and distributing them better, or having more money going to the artists, the management teams under the current system, or if there's any way to have a more granular system of identifying what will go to whom after it has been retrieved.
The good news from my perspective is I'm going to leave that to other panelists.
And I don't think you'll get any of us to touch it either.
There are probably folks who are expert opinions in this room, but I'm not going to. Yeah,
You can
I'm
leave
with David.
You can leave it for another panel.
Yeah, that's probably not a bad
I think
idea.
the next panel will actually be a good one for that, right?
Yeah,
It's a real sticky question.
it is, yeah. And I think in our prior roles, we probably could have answered it fairly well, but in this role, not so much.
And some of that heat, I think, might be different when we reach more scale. I think some of the, I noticed that I don't hear as many complaints from artists by and large now as you did 2-3 years ago. And I think as that scales more, that might help take care of that. But yeah, there's some intriguing questions.
The growing pie will help everything. I'm going to call on Alan Sorensen next. I just wanted to check. I thought there might have been some microphones around for questions from the audience. And also, can I ask for people to identify themselves?
All right, I'll talk loud. I'm Alan Sorensen. So we're talking about industry trends, and your presentation said a lot of interesting things that are happening on the consumer side, what an economist would call the demand side of this market. I'm curious if you have some insight as to what's changing or happening on the supply side of the market with artists. My understanding is that the costs of both producing and promoting music have gone way down in the last decade, and how is that changing things on the artist side?
Yeah, I mean, I think the barrier to I don't remember the exact number, but a few years ago, somebody said, "Did you realize there were kind of 90,000, 90 million?" David probably knows the number. It was some astonishing increase in the number of releases because the barriers to entry, both from you don't need $1 million soundboard anymore.
Yeah, when you couple things like
Yeah.
TuneCore and CD Baby together with things like GarageBand and things like that, there was a year where there were 105,000 new release albums that had at least one sale. That's not counting the ones that I put out that didn't have any sales. So, yeah,
But yeah.
So the data sets that you were all collecting can pick up these kinds of trends and
yeah.
expanded supply.
Yeah, certainly. Again, it's not going to count the things that we get a lot of metadata. We just completed our acquisition of Gracenote earlier this year, and they have a ton of metadata. That is their life, is metadata. And you look at the metadata that never has had a blip of consumption, take all that stuff out of it, and yeah, you can still see there's been a tremendous uptick.
It is, and I touched on it, it is less expensive to get music into the market. Almost anyone can do it. But I want to take you back to like at the beginning of the internet, and I would go to independent label conventions, and some of these smaller labels would be excited. It's like, oh boy, now I can go directly to the consumer. And what we soon learned was that the average consumer wasn't looking for music I never heard of.com.
Yep.
So the interesting thing, when you look at the weekly charts that Dave referred to and that I've lived with, they're still driven by youth, but as you saw, the distribution going out, now that we've got other channels, and with Alexa and other voice-activated systems, the early data from there suggests that, and I don't know if this might have been Russ, I got it from a record company, but classical, country, and Christian were 3 genres that really got a lift from Alexa. All of those skewing toward adults.
Yep.
So there's some hope for stakeholders that are in the adult world that'll help lift that. But the hits are the hits, and they still drive the business.
Yeah.
And you've got in a sense, David and I were just chatting about this before. You've got in a sense, what the whole world went through with radio promotion. Just as how in the 20, 30 years ago it was virtually impossible to get. You could be an artist. It's virtually impossible to get your music into Walmart or into K-Rock. Well, now you've got playlists, on the streaming services. So you've got, you can make it, but get on those playlists that people are listening to intensely day in and day out is probably just as difficult as it was getting on, MCA back in the day.
Yeah, or on radio.
Yeah.
Another thing that Geoff said that was interesting, and I've seen the same, we've run the same types of numbers here, is the top heaviness of all of it. You can put out as much stuff as you want, but you're really getting squashed by the biggest of the bigs. And it was one of those things when I was at the distribution company when iTunes launched, and one of the things we thought was exactly what Geoff said, is that, now that every song's available, this long tail is going to get real big and fat. And it didn't. And last year when we looked at it, it was 0.75% of the songs made up 80% of the sales. And then I thought, well, this has got to be getting better on streaming, like Russ said. There's
Right.
playlists, there's all of these things, no matter how narrow your music focus is. There's a playlist out there for you, and probably a ton of them, and all that stuff is going to get listened to more. That same 3/4 of the songs for streaming last year were 86% of the total streams. So it's,
Right.
if anything, the big, giant, fat head is getting bigger, gianter,
Yeah,
fatter.
I mean, because
who'd thought?
I've seen David's data, I've used David's data, I've used the buzz angle data, and, you know, people are still going on and going, Alexa, play Smoke on the Water.
Yep.
You know, I mean, that's just, that's what happens overwhelmingly.
But that's one of the great things, I think, the discovery piece, and you've probably got more great research than I do on discovery, but how important discovery is to a streaming consumer. It's not, yeah, it's all of us. We all want to learn new music. We all want to hear new music, whether it's old or new. We want to discover new music. But that discovery piece continues to come in at a very high placement in how important is it to you to have a streaming service that feeds you discovery.
Right.
So there's some hope there for sure.
Right, and there's actually more people interested in rediscovery, you know, the soundtracks of our life, prom songs, all that, than are interested in discovery of new music. You know, as these guys pointed out, you know, you see what happens with new music versus catalog. We like things that are familiar to us.
Yes?
I know Gigi Johnson from UCLA. I know this could be another half hour. Can you guys give a little bit of a smattering to big U.S. members? What's happening internationally?
Let me apologize also, Gigi. I said Gigi Fernandez before, who's a tennis player.
Yes.
And I meant to thank Gigi Johnson for her assistance.
I can see my backhand up.
Yeah, I think not to get all competitive in spirit here. I think we're both kind of in the same place in tracking global numbers where we both really want to do it. We're both really working hard on it. We both got the same end game, but I don't think either one of us are super duper there yet.
Yeah, and we wouldn't tell you right now in front of each other.
Yeah.
But from what we read,
Canada, we can talk about Canada. That's international.
well, not just that though. If you look at the record company financials as they come out,
Yeah.
it's not just happening here, and
It's even in China.
Carrie and Josh will say that their counterparts are seeing some robust growth happening in different territories. As well.
I mean, it wouldn't shock me. It's if you take a look at what the potential is in the Middle East, in Africa, and certainly in China, and there's kind of two steps. One is getting the mobile payment systems involved, set up. The other is getting the services up. But I mean, if we're here 10 years ago, and Dave or I show a chart about the top streaming services, it wouldn't surprise me that Tencent is, has some ridiculous share of there. So,
Tencent is the Chinese streaming company.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole industry is going to be turned on its head once you start to monetize the population outside of the developed countries.
And I talked to a couple of people working the independent label community recently, actually independent distribution, and there's great excitement about what can happen in this streaming world where a song that's hot in Singapore can become hot somewhere else, and there's a lot of concentration on how is it we can move a success story that happens here someplace else.
Yeah.
Yodeling music is going to be the next big genre, Dave told me.
Yeah, you can imagine
This is probably a good point to make a transition. We have a 15-minute break, and in the next panel, Joel Waldfogel, I think, will address some of the questions about whether...
His question.
About how the dominance of the U.S. or how music might spread across cultures might be different going forward. Anyway, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
And